To truly grasp the systems and policies that shape land, food, and water use in the U.S., we have to dive into the historical context that has shaped these frameworks. This understanding is essential for crafting effective solutions for communities. Today, we are honored to have Jordan Curry Carter, an influential healing justice practitioner dedicated to food justice. With an intersectional approach, Jordan draws on the wisdom of elders, ancestors, and the natural world to inform his work. Jordan is the former Chef Western Cohort Manager and the former Director of Power Building and a board member of the Instigator, a Diverse City Fund, a prominent family foundation in Washington, D.C. Jordan will highlight pivotal moments in U.S. history that really relate to land use, food, and water. He will reveal how these historical events have paved the way for the inequities that minority communities face in our society today. Rather than use any more of our time to talk about the impressive work that Jordan has done, we will place his bio in the chat for you to review. The general format for today's webinar will be one 40-minute presentation, followed by a question and answer period from our audience. We invite you to put your questions, recommendations, or other additional information into the chat as a resource, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can during the end of the session. Please keep yourself muted so we are not interrupted by any background noise. And Jordan, we would invite you to begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Can folks hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank y'all. It is a pleasure to be sharing space with you, all the places you could be at this moment that our paths are crossing. So with today's conversation, I just want to start by stating 400 years of U.S. land use, water, and food. There is so much to cover. We will not be able to cover all that has occurred, but I really want to emphasize and highlight some key points that stood out to me and share those with you as we go through this. Clarissa, if you could hit the next slide. And what I really want to do is take us through a framework of stolen land, stolen lives, stolen labor, and stolen resources. So keep that frame in mind as we go through for today. So really to begin with the next slide, in order to ground us in 400 years, it felt critical to me for us to really look at the doctrine of discovery from the 1400s and the series of decrees issued by the Catholic Church authorizing colonial powers to first seize lands, any and all lands not currently occupied by Christians. Secondly, subjugating people in Africa and in the, quote, New World. These issues continued with Pope Alexander VI in 1493 and further asserted rights to colonize, convert, and enslave. And I ground us here as we move into 1492 on the next slide with Christopher Columbus and the, quote, discovering of North America as he made his way across the Atlantic. Next slide, please. I then want to move us a bit into the U.S. founding of 1776 and the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, frameworks of all men created equal. And as that framework is being put forth, if we move to the next slide, we really begin to understand this era between 1778 and 1871, where 374 treaties were signed and ratified between the US government and native nations. Before that came to a close on March 3rd, 1871, with Section 71. And I also want to highlight here that most of these treaties were not honored. Again, I'll say that most of these 374 treaties between 1778 and 1871 were not honored. Next slide, please. We then move into the 1830s with very explicit policies, such as the Indian Removal Act. And in it, President Jackson, I invite you to spend more time with it, but what I really want to highlight in this moment with you is President Jackson being, quote, very supportive of a speedy removal, as he felt it was important not only to the US, but to the Indians themselves, to separate them from immediate contact with white settlers, which would free indigenous people from the power of the states and allow them to, quote, pursue happiness in their own way and put a stop to their slow extinction. So I want to let that sink in for a moment, again, as we orient to the stolen land framework. And I'll move us to the next slide, where we then shift gears into policies such as the Trail of Tears between 1830 and the 1870s, where indigenous relatives were forcibly displaced over 5,000 miles. And you can see some of that in this map visualized of what some of these what the route of some of these forced removals were. And in it, or the result of these actions, were land grabs of 9 states, those being Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Illinois, Kentucky, Missouri, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Tennessee. And Clarissa, if you could move us to the next slide. So again, I want to orient and really begin with the doctrine of discovery, because it helps us to make sense of policies like manifest destiny as they come into consciousness in 1845 with, quote, the belief that the US is destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent by John O. Sullivan. And so with this policy and this imagery that you see, this is really national agenda of the international law and order of the doctrine of discovery from the 1400s coming into play into US policy. Clarissa, if you could hit the next slide, please. And we shift from that era into the 1862 having the Homestead Act, which encouraged white people to invade Indian lands in the Midwest. And those actions were then followed by the General Allotment Act of 1887. I want to share this with you first. The law authorized the president to break up reservation land, which had been held in common by members of a tribe, into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals, and that being shared by Henry L. Dawes. And we'll continue a little bit with Henry on the next slide to really emphasize 2 points here. First, that this Allotment Act declared native allottees as, quote, incompetent. And by doing so, mandated that the US would retain legal title to the land as trustees for 25 years. And again, in doing so, between this time period of 1887 and 1934, 90 million acres of indigenous lands were taken. $90 million acres. And I'll move us to the next slide. And with this, I think we'll have time. So I will, if we can get the video, Clarissa, if not, I'll just speak on it for a moment. But this video that I want to share with you, this is how what I've covered, a lot of what I covered was taught to me in elementary school.
One thing you will discover when you get next to one another is everybody needs some elbow room, elbow room.
And yeah, I just want to let that sink in for y'all, and you can feel free to put a comment or a thought in the chat if there's something that's coming up for you as we continue to move through this presentation. But I couldn't let not share that with you. I remember this as critical pieces of my elementary educational experience of being shown this video. And I thought maybe folks would be familiar with it, or that it would be a surprise to many to see this.
I don't mean to interrupt you. I remember that. I remember all the house rocks. I remember loving it, taking it hook, line, and sinker. And oh my God, talking about brainwashing and whitewashing and just rewriting history. We acquired the land without any fuss. Oh my God.
Yeah, so I really appreciate you sharing that. And I hope we have more time in the discussion to raise some of that. I'm going to move us to our next section on stolen lives. Clarissa, if you could hit the next slide. So again, here really wanting to orient with 1619 and quote Point Comfort in Virginia, where the first 30 Africans that had been stolen and later enslaved on these lands planted the seed for chattel slavery to be a system based on race with lifetime servitude. And I'll move us to the next slide. I wanted to share this to really give you all a visual sense in this chart of the total population of Black people from 1790 to 1880, noting the critical transitions in 1860, and to see both the enslaved Black population from 1790 to 1860, as well as the free Black population. And next slide. Again, as we're talking about stolen lives, I want to highlight from 1619 to 1808, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were enslaved and transported via the transatlantic slave trade, and that more than 2 million relatives died en route. With the Trail of Tears as well, from 1830 to 1870, there's estimates here with this visual of just under 13,000 indigenous relatives dying during this forced removal. And next slide, please. I also want to point out, again, in the acquiring of this land without a fuss, as was shared in the Elbow Room video, when we look at indigenous populations pre-contact of 1492, it's reported that as many as 15 million native people lived across North America. And by the late 1800s, that number was below 240,000. When we're talking about stolen lives, and those lives coming via land theft and the violence, as well as forced removals and death by disease and starvation campaigns. One such example being the killing of many buffalo, knowing that that was a primary source of food for indigenous people, and with that information in mind, deciding to wage war on buffalo to starve a population. And I will move us to the next slide to now move us into stolen labor. And with the next slide, the enslavement and economic development of the US was built on unpaid, uncompensated agriculture. Rice, cotton, wheat, sugarcane. It's reported that between 1619 and 1865, the US was producing 75% of the world's cotton. That is all cotton that was produced across the supply chain of enslaved people without compensation. And I'll move us to the next. Also want to point out US apartheid from 1887 to 1964, and the codification and system of laws and practices to subordinate Black people. And there's a couple images here that speak to this time period. There's many more that we could delve into, but I'll move us to the next slide for today. I also felt it was critical to highlight that this apartheid agricultural structure after the end of the Civil War and during the Jim Crow era, that many freed Black people had minimal employment options, and in many cases were sharecropping on white-owned land, in some instances former enslavers' land, and as a result, many Black people were chronically indebted to white landowners. Next slide, please. During this era of apartheid, there were a few acts that were passed that I want to share with you all. First is the Wagner Act of 1935, which established and recognized legal rights of workers to first and foremost organize and join labor unions, to engage in collective bargaining, and it also established the National Labor Relations Board. However, it excluded agricultural and domestic workers from these legal rights and protections. Next slide, please. The second act passed in this era was the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, which established the minimum wage, overtime pay, and prohibiting child labor. And this act of 1938 also excluded agricultural and domestic workers from these legal protections. Next slide, please. And I wanted to take a moment to focus on the agricultural worker abuses that continue to unfold in this temporary or contemporary era of undocumented and H-2A visa holders, specifically being exposed to higher occurrences of sexual violence, of wage theft, withholding of payment, with little to no protection, as well as safety issues such as exposure to pesticides, extreme heat, and in some instances, minimal to no breaks as they are laboring in the agricultural industry. And I'll move us to the next slide. That shifts us into stolen resources. And on this next slide, we're going to start to move into land and water use. Next slide, please. Starting with housing segregation and redlining. The federal policies of the 1930s, redlining, which was a discriminatory practice of denying loans or services within a specific geographic area due to the race or ethnicity of its residents. And I want to, there's a book I'd encourage folks to read if they haven't already, The Color of Law, which really lays out a lot of frameworks, but I wanted to just share a couple of visuals here from a project at the University of Richmond, Mapping Inequality, which is an interactive map that has redlining maps of all of these cities that you see represented visually. And on the next slide, I just wanted to share so you could get a sense of what that interaction looks like from the city of Denver, Colorado. And you can see this stoplight system from green to red. And I'll just read for you. Green is an area that's a quote hotspot where good mortgage lenders with available funds are willing to make their maximum loans, perhaps up to 75 to 80% of appraisal. And that is a designation that was exclusively reserved for white people. At the same time, I want to just highlight the red area, which is rated D, hazardous, and to give you some characteristic, or to give you some language from that, which is area characterized by detrimental influences in a pronounced degree, under desirable populations, or an infiltration of it. They recommend lenders refuse to make loans in these areas or only on a conservative basis. So this is the housing landscape really being put forth in the 1930s that carries on. There are other policies such as urban renewal, as well as racial covenants that are also happening around this time. That these are terms that, again, we don't have time to get deeper into for the sake of this conversation, but I would encourage folks to reference The Color of Law and other housing segregation resources that cover this time period. And I want to move us to the next slide to really bring this forth to ways that this is showing up in communities today, with a few examples. The first is Cancer Alley, which some folks may be familiar with, the 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River with over 150 chemical plants. It's estimated that there are 50 toxic chemicals polluting the air from New Orleans to Baton Rouge. Some of those toxins being benzene, formaldehyde, ethylene oxide, and chloroprene. And I want to highlight this because this is, again, a land use and a resource extraction framework. Something that maybe we've maybe heard of Cancer Alley and the struggle that organizations like Rise St. James have been engaged in, fighting against these petrochemical expansions. I'm going to move us from this to the next slide to focus on some other struggles that are happening in real time. The first being the Apache Oak Flat, which has been a sacred religious site for the Apache, where they've had religious ceremonies since time. And I highlight this because what you see here is Oak Flat visualized in this photo. And they have been met with Resolution Copper, which has plans, and potentially there's reports that this land transfer will happen early next week on the 16th to transfer this Oak Flat to Resolution Copper. And in doing so, Resolution Copper has stated that they plan to turn this visual that you see of Oak Flat into a 1,100 foot deep crater that will be 2 miles wide, so that it can be utilized for copper mining. And I note here just two cases that get us to that point. In 2024, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals said that the land transfer was not subject to federal laws protecting religious freedom. And just maybe 3 weeks ago, the Supreme Court denied reviewing of the Apache Strongholds case, saying that they were essentially moving it forward to the point where this land transfer can unfold next week without even hearing Apache Strongholds arguments as to why this sacred site should be protected under religious freedom laws. And the last piece here I want to share is on the next slide, XAI, which maybe some folks are familiar with, which is in Memphis, Tennessee. And currently there are 35 methane gas turbines mounted on trailer trucks, releasing 17.2 tons of formaldehyde into the air. This is for a AI supercomputer, and it's estimated that 1 to 1.5 million gallons of water daily, again, that's 1 million to 1.5 million gallons of water daily, will be needed to cool this AI supercomputer. And lastly, that the energy demands are 150 megawatts of energy annually to power this supercomputer. So I wanted to just share a through line here of examples, because there are many as it relates to the ways that resources are being extracted in this moment that come out of these legacies. And I'll move us to the next slides, which I think we'll have to go through a little bit quicker so we have our time for Q&A. First being again, the ways that climate change affects water and water relatives with ocean acidification from carbon dioxide, droughts preventing stream spawning, as well as contaminated shellfish from floods and algae blooms. And those are some of the visuals you can see there. Next slide, please. As we quickly go through food, agriculture affects climate in that 52% of methane emissions released are from the agriculture system, 84% of nitrous oxide emissions, and 17% of fossil fuel use. And I also wanted to highlight the water intensive nature, that 70% of water used globally is for agriculture. Next slide. Also, crops such as corn, which has been very much a monocrop that is for a long time been a part of the Farm Bill as a critical grain, as you see here. U.S. it's being used as 95% of feed grain, meaning that cows, for example, are eating corn instead of grass. And so you can understand that that's not what they have historically been eating, which will lead to and has led to disease requiring other kinds of antibiotic usage to offset some of these illnesses that result from transitioning the food source of cows, for example. And also it's been used, corn being used to produce ethanol. And I wanted to just note here that it requires 29% more fossil fuel energy to convert corn into ethanol than the amount of ethanol that it produces. And I'll move to the next slide, just to highlight the food waste here. That 30 to 40% of US food supply ends up in the landfill. Estimates that that's about $161 billion of groceries. Again, that's an estimate from 2010. It's now 2025. So you can think about how that number may have changed. And also to note that when this food waste ends up in landfills, it releases methane into the environment as it decomposes. And I will move to the next slide, which is the closing slide of beloved ancestor Fannie Lou Hamer, quoted for saying, "Nobody's free until everybody's free." And I will close the presentation there.
Thank you, Jordan. Extremely informative, thought-provoking, insightful. Really appreciate the way that you shared all of that information with us. I do want to make sure that we have some time for questions, if there are any posted in the chat, or if you would like to raise your hand and come off mute. We do have someone monitoring the chat, so we will be able to capture as many questions as possible. But really appreciate the timeline and the way, the framing, so that when we think about what we see today, we recognize the historical context of it all. So thank you so much. Are there questions? Let's see. I
see Lois has raised her hand.
Okay. Please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Lois Cody from Manchester, New Hampshire. Jordan, that was so much history, so well delivered and so compactly. I'm flooded with it and shocked at how much I was deprived of learning when I was growing up. And I'm 78, and it's taken me this long to learn all of it. My question is about the two labor relations bills and laws that were passed in the 30s. Who made the decision to exclude the agricultural and domestic workers? And was somebody at that time championing including them? I wonder about that. Was there anybody speaking up? Because that was so blatantly, obviously racist.
Yeah, I really appreciate your question and sharing how this presentation was for you. I don't know I can't speak to the specifics, but what I can tell you is that those were both passed by Congress. So if that gives you some context as to who the players are that decided collectively we're going to move this forward without agriculture workers and domestic workers, both in 1935 and again in 1938. And again, understanding that, as you said, that the racism, but understanding that in the context of an apartheid era in which Jim Crow is very much alive. So it's not an accident that folks who have been directed or provided with opportunities for survival within the agricultural and domestic spaces that they would be without via these acts of Congress and the president signing both of those into law.
Would you comment on what you see today in terms of immigration raids, ICE raids, the focus on at least one particular community at this point, but sort of where you see this in the historical context of what you presented to us?
Yeah, wow. I appreciate this question. Um, and if I could ask you, because my mind is going in a lot of directions, if you could just add a little bit more specificity to your question so I can answer it directly.
Yeah, in some ways, I'm interested in hearing where you think this latest episode is going and sort of the places where you think there can be intervention based on historically what we have seen. Maybe that helps.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I feel I have to start with June Jordan, who said that we are the ones that we've been waiting for. And I say that because I'm convinced that nobody's coming to save us, especially in this moment of escalation. And given that, what are we willing to do collectively to intervene or to disrupt? And I think we're seeing signs of that as folks, regardless of the escalations, National Guard being federalized in LA, Marines being in LA, everyday people are still showing up and saying, we're not okay with this. And you're seeing now in Texas, Abbott has now sent National Guard into San Antonio. And the rhetoric has been from 45 and Stephen Miller that this is an insurrection. And they've been very clear that this is not, that this is something they're willing to entertain across Turtle Island, across the nation. So I say that to say, I see continued escalations unfolding in the weeks and months as we have seen in the last 5 months. But folks really having to make a decision to say, and a coordinated plan, and it may be the same in some places, but it's also going to be very localized. What are folks willing to do to take care of one another? And to, my hope is that we will see life-affirming alternatives when it's clear and folks are being radicalized by the death and destruction that's being presented. Because it's starting here with these kinds of, starting with immigrants. We already saw what was happening to international students being targeted. And so I see these as test cases for folks to really experiment with what is it that we can do. And at what point will folks, as we change who the target is, at what point are folks going to say enough is enough? Because if that does not happen, then there will be no point at which enough is enough.
Okay, well, we
You asked me, so
I did ask the question, and so I'm responsible for taking us down that road, but I did feel that it was an important question. So I know that we could continue this discussion much longer for sure, but we do have to wrap up the session. I do want to thank Jordan Curry Carter again for presenting. Thank you for being a part of the webinar. To our audience, thank you for joining us. I hope that you found it useful and informative and thought-provoking. As a reminder, the webinars are held on the second Friday of the month. Our next webinar will be on July 11th at this same time, 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And at that time on July 11th, we will be covering housing and energy efficiency. Before you leave, we would ask that you take a moment to complete the webinar survey if you haven't done so already. The link is in the chat for you to click on. And as I said, we do want to thank you all for joining us. Wish you a safe and productive weekend. This would conclude our session for today. So thank you again and have a great day and a safe weekend.